Hannah, as someone who has had their own experience of grief and your experience also of writing, I would really love to start with how creative practices like writing, but not excluding things like art and music and dance, can serve as a method for processing grief and facilitating healing.
Wow, what a meaty question to start off with. Um, I think, well, I can only speak from my own experience, really, is that in the beginning, because when I went through my season of grief and loss, is that I was in a place where I felt like I had no one I could trust, no one that I could rely on or confide in. And now looking back, I can see that absolutely that's not true. But 5 years ago, I was quite a different person. And so I actually, I journaled as a child and then kind of left that as I became a teenager and into my 20s. But yeah, I really just got out a pen and paper and less a creative outlet and more just like that was my therapy or that was my way of expressing what I was feeling. I I had this mantra that no judgment comes from a pen and paper, which, that says it all really. I felt like I could put anything on the page that I wanted to, but even then, like, there were things that I didn't write down because then they would take them out of my head and make them seem real, like things that I didn't want to see as truth in a tangible form. And I guess that's the first part of it. And now, 5 years since that season of grief, it is more, some reflecting on that internal world, noticing the beauty of the natural world as well. It's for me in the beginning. It was definitely a way to cope and get through, more than a way to be creative. Like I spent years in engineering. I didn't see myself as creative at all.
Yeah. And that was so interesting, the way that you said you didn't feel that you could trust anybody. That perspective has changed, but that pen and paper, as you said, which can't judge, felt like a place that you could go to. But I'm also interested in the fact that you were aware that there were still things that you weren't putting on the page. Do you remember that time in your life, what it was like to see some things going onto the page? Like, what difference did that make? I know you weren't putting everything on the page, but whatever it was that you did put on the page, what was it like to see it there rather than have it back here in the head?
Oh, some of it, such a relief. Yeah, just getting some of those spinning downward spiral thoughts and, just sometimes really scary thoughts out on paper. And whether that was like around the situation about things that were happening in my life and in my internal world, really, even in that moment, just getting them down and kind of rewriting it all out. And even in that moment, once I feel like it was done and complete, we go back and look at it and be like, wow, is that really what's going on inside my head? And sometimes it was in that moment, sometimes it was a few days later, and I was able to, whether that was just mentally or to actually write it down and be like, well, here's maybe a flip side to that, or here is a more helpful way to frame that, or here's what we're going to do about this. Typically, like, I also started to, this is probably where it actually all started in the very beginning, was writing down some of those questions that there just weren't answers to. And sometimes a response would come from somewhere within me. Sometimes it wouldn't, but that whatever you choose to, how you choose to see it or believe, like a higher self or your wise woman, I definitely tapped into that part of me really early on, and she saw me through it.
That's so interesting, Hannah, this idea that the difference between the question being here in the mind and on the page. And as you said, it's not that there's going to be an answer every time from that higher place, but that's definitely the experience that I've had when I start to bring the questions into my journaling practice. It's almost like by asking myself on the page, it's sending a different signal to the brain to say, now we want a response, whereas I feel like when it's just a question in the head, it just stays as a question.
Yeah. And I'm someone who has a very busy brain, spent a lot of time up there as it is, that the less time I spend up there, the better. And as a practice, even currently, is to start bringing it down and writing with pen and paper. How does that live? That's it. Embodied movement, it's somatic, it is like an active expression in a way, that link with out of your head and your heart through your hand and onto paper.
I love that you mentioned that. Thank you for mentioning that, because sometimes there can be this idea that writing is just an intellectual process, but I do find when it becomes in connection with the body, it shifts. And one thing that I'm always fascinated by is how I can be journaling and I can see the words coming onto the page, and I can also be aware of thoughts in my mind that are not the words that I'm writing. And so for me, because I too have a very busy mind, what the practice of journaling does for me is it shows me there's like the sort of truth that's coming from a deeper place, and then that surface level of judgmental thought. So the more I write and just keep writing despite the thoughts that are like, this isn't very good, I can't believe that you wrote a sentence with that word in it, what would someone think if they read this, I'm also aware, but there's something more beautiful and truthful that's coming out as well. So it's really helped me separate the truthful thoughts that really come from the center of me versus those kind of, that radio of thoughts that just plays incessantly.
Yeah. And I think kind of as you practice that and bringing that voice onto the paper, it grows and evolves, but also helps when we write kind of all of it, everything that's in our brain, whether it's helpful or not, onto paper, get to see that distinction and be able to see like, well, that is a thought that is actually not helpful, but if it's spinning around your brain, you're off the book. Well, for me, I don't catch it.
Yeah, that's lovely, that idea that you can catch the things that are unconsciously impacting you because the thought is there, but you're not hearing it until you write it down on the page and you're like, oh my gosh. Now I realise I've been thinking this for a week.
Well, for someone like probably most of my adult life, it's like, wow, have I? And that's the thing that it's really interesting to reflect on now with a whole different perspective and a whole lot more compassion and self-awareness probably too, is it was just hideously awful to myself, and I wanted to raise that because there are people that I have worked with too who maybe it's a Kiwi thing, I don't know, but yeah, I think it feels like for me it definitely felt like I was being really awful, and I didn't want you to myself, and I didn't want you outside to see that, let alone all like what I've written on the page. And I feel like a lot of us are going around like that and trying to hide that from the world. And once with anything, once you see that you're actually not alone in it, that it kind of takes that weight off, and we can do something with it.
Yeah. That's such a powerful share, Hannah, because I'm the same, and I don't think in my work or in the spiritual personal development circles that I spend most of my time in, I haven't found someone who's sort of at the very other end of the spectrum. And I think you're absolutely right. The more we can be aware of, I'm not the only one, because I think if we think we're the only ones being hideous to ourselves, we then think it's justified. And if we're holding that as a secret, that can be even more destructive. But if we realize, everyone's being hideous to themselves, we sort of start to see it's a bit like, well, the phrase that comes to mind is the emperor's new clothes. We're all falling for that hideous self-talk without realizing, hey, maybe it's not real.
Yeah.
So, Hannah, I'd love to now go a bit deeper into something that really came up for me when I was preparing for this conversation. Firstly, I was like, I'm really looking forward to talking to this lady. I've seen her on Instagram. I really value her content. But then I had this voice in my head that was like, but you haven't lost anybody. Why are you so interested in a grief coach when you haven't lost someone in your life? And there was another experience alongside that, which was really happening in my body, which is that my body was holding an immense amount of grief.
Mm.
And when I explored your website, it talks about grief and the loss of somebody, but it also talks about endings and it talks about transitions. And I thought to myself, wow, this could be a really interesting opportunity to talk about the loss of someone, definitely, but also the grief that many of us do feel when we do personal development work and we leave an old life behind and we're trying to make that transition into a new life, a new way of showing up in the world. I want to just pause there because you've sort of been nodding and smiling. So I sort of love to hear your thoughts about that, about people who feel almost like an imposter syndrome because they're walking around with grief, but they're like, I haven't lost anybody. What's going on?
Yeah. Oh, this is a massive topic. And I'm not quite sure where to go in. But maybe I'll start with this, is that it's the way I think about grief is that it's a natural response to loss. And when we define loss, that comes up everywhere. Like, that can be endings of any kind, transitions, like life stages, child's health, and, COVID was an awful, but like a really classic example of this, and that loss of security and hopes and dreams and like natural loss on top of like the human loss as well. And it's not quite in New Zealand just yet. It's not really recognised as such, and probably half of my clients that I work with are death specific losses. But others, the other half, will reach out not because of another type of loss specifically, but they just really struggling with figuring out how to move forward without recognizing that the loss, it is a type of loss that they experience, and it is a grief, I suppose, shared with that needs that acknowledgement and honouring, and often some like tools and strategies to work through that.
That phrase. Oh, thank you. That phrase, move forward. I want to circle that a little bit more, Hannah, because I know that does come up in grief coaching, this idea of how to move forward. I'm curious about this idea of endings, because for me, as I've been making a transition in my life, I recognize that a part of my brain wants to somehow keep attached to the old and sort of somehow sneak bits of the old into the new. So I'm really curious, what would you say to someone? And it could be someone who's lost someone, or someone who's experiencing a need to make a change, lost a way of being in the world, lost a career. But the importance of having some kind of ending, and how do you create that ending? Because I'm sure that even when you lose someone, it's not just, okay, well they're gone, that's over, because you've got thoughts and feelings and memories that are still coming with you. So how do you navigate an ending and make it clean so that you can move forward?
I first impulse to respond there is that there never really is a clear ending. And also tying back to that concept and moving forward, it's the most simple way that I can describe it at the moment. But I also treat it carefully, because we do live in a world where everything happens and everyone's in such a rush to get somewhere. And I'm very conscious of this, but try, it's probably in the context that hopefully softened it a wee bit. But I do think there should be no hurry to move forward as well. And in those that hard to speak about the umbrella, like all versions of losses, but thinking about it in probably a death specific context, is that in those early days, weeks and months, it can be just like, right, that's over, want to move forward, but you've actually got all the that emotional, and that impacts us on a nervous system level too. So we've got all that going on under the surface, or we might look like we're kind of functioning and getting through a day, but inside there's a whole lot going on, and that takes time and the right support and a few other things. And maybe I'm in the land of, I don't know that there should, obviously if it's harmful or abusive, or there needs to be at some form of clear-cut ending there, but in most cases it's a gradual step by step. When you're ready, or maybe you're doing this other, like the self-awareness or personal development work, or getting that emotional support. And I think that's what I found is by doing that kind of piece, that it's noticed that the other things kind of fall away in their own times. Does that, I don't know, how does that
I love that.
with your loss experience?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Let's go back to what you said about this culture of wanting to move forward really quickly. I think for me, a few years ago, when I wanted to make a transition in my business, that was very much the energy that was around me. It was like, right, you've got to pivot, you've got to rebrand, and it's all got to happen very quickly, and then you've got to get up and running again. But then that links to the second piece that you said, which was about the nervous system. Because I was, outwardly, the website was coming on, the rebranding was happening, but internally my nervous system was so tight, so activated. And that was really, in the end, when I had to start listening to the body and basically taking a step forward and thinking, this has taken me into an extreme stress state, and having to take that step back. And I'm just curious, because that can be such a beautiful way to guide, but also it can really trigger us, because we're seeing everybody else recovering, especially when it comes to grief. There's this idea, and I read this in some of your content, I should be getting back on with emails. It's probably time to get back to work. But actually, if the body isn't ready, we can't, right? But I don't know if there's yet the real honoring of the body that's taking place versus that kind of outward presentation that we're putting on. So can you talk a little bit more about the body and listening to the body and the role that that plays in moving forward in a way that's going to be right for you as an individual?
This is the piece that I am super passionate about. But because I'm passionate about it, there might be a lot of words, but I'll try and put them in some order that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think what's helpful is, whether that's a grief or a death-specific grief or other type of loss or any change release, is that when there's any change that can be perceived as a threat to our nervous systems, it's been trained to protect us, looking out for, and mostly these days they are perceived threats. Like those illness emails that we have to get back to, or someone cutting us off with traffic, or all of those modern day type of perceived threats. And those are some kind of obvious ones, but when we get to talking about loss and grief is so much, especially with the death, like so much has changes that, like, the loss, yes, but you've also probably, like, it's a strong relationship that you've lost. It's routines, it's social, expectations, or how you kind of fit in and belong into your community or family or neighborhoods or network, and all of that. Like, it's quite nuanced, but the impact of it on our nervous system is so real. And typically many of us are spending, even before we meet this season of loss or grief or changes, that we're often, as you were speaking to, like, often living in this really highly activated state previously anyway, so we can only imagine what that, a large stressor is going to do to our bodies. And I can't remember the next part of your question. Where did you want to go from here?
Well, let me pick up on what you said, this idea that social expectation can then have that impact on the nervous system. So let's say we're either wanting to find a gentle way, an authentic way to move forward from the loss of a loved one, or a way to move forward from a life transition, a significant change that's come about as a personal transformation. And we want to move forward in that way that feels right for us. And often when it feels right, we feel calm in the body. We feel a sense of yes. We feel a sense of, when I'm in this place, like nothing matters. And then suddenly our attention goes to perhaps imagining what other people think, or perhaps suddenly clocking on what other people are doing. And instantly there's that trigger. And I suppose it comes back to that design that we have. We've evolved from fitting in, haven't we? We've evolved as being part of a tribe and not being too different and not standing out. And yet I sort of feel that today, people who specialize in areas like yourself in grief, who are saying we need a more authentic way, we need a more open way to discuss this topic. We're sort of looking at ways to be unique and individual and to not fit in because it's not working. Like what the mass is doing isn't working.
Yeah.
So let's come back to the nervous system. We want to find a way that is perhaps unique and different. We sort of want to evolve differently as a species, because I think there's lots of us that would agree that we do need to sort of change the way that we're evolving as a species if we want to evolve in relationship with the land, let's say. So how can someone find a way to evolve their own path when they keep getting triggered by these very old systems in the body that are designed to make us fit in and keep us safe?
I think the first thing is simply, as it can be with so many things, is to simply being aware of the thought or bodily response that you're feeling in body. As sometimes it is like something happens in your external world, and then that sets off a thought train that's not really helpful, supportive, and then that can set off your body, and because then you activate in your nervous system, then that flips up back to your brain, and then it's just this compounding. I know because I've been there, so that you can be thoughts, but also as it's not accessible to everyone, but if you can be, to notice what situations that you feel uncomfortable, and whatever that means to you. It might be tension in your jaw, tension in your shoulders and the abdomen, maybe like a heat or a nausea, like all migraine, like all these different types of, well, yes, they can be indicators of, actual health problems too, but it's interesting to, even if you just note them down, is to be like, oh, in this kind of situation, I start to like close, not to restrict and close myself off, or being around those people gives me headache. I think that is a really nice place to start, and then that can help give you an indication of, maybe it is setting boundaries or making different decisions about how whether you go into those situations or not. And sometimes you have to. And then, because everyone is different, we have our own nervous systems. We're shaped within our family environment, which is also linked to generational, as well as the social and environmental and political soup that we live in. So yes, it's an individual thing, but also a global context too. That is really important. Maybe we'll come back to that, but and then once we kind of have an understanding of that, there's been working with, whether it's as an individual, you can explore those things for yourself, or whether it's with some kind of support, is exploring what practices or what activities do bring you back to that flow state, that feeling calm, rest and digest. And the more of that we can do over time, like practice over time, can ease that activated, because we do want that activated at times. Like if we needed to run away or run through, chase someone, or we need to defend ourselves, then absolutely we want that activations. We don't want to go away completely. Yes,
it's interesting. It's almost like, for me, it seems like a shifting of how I relate to that activation. You talked about self-awareness being really key. And for me, that's why I understand the importance of working with somebody, because often I notice this with my own clients, and you probably see it yourself in your work. What I observe is the client being self-aware, and that's the point that they realize, to go back to what we were talking about before, how unpleasant they then react to themselves. And it was the same with me when I was on my healing journey. I would often catch myself holding my breath. I was in such a state of panic. And then my response to that was, what the hell is wrong with you? When actually what I needed to do was take a breath. So my response kept me in that state of freeze. And it was only when I discovered breath work that I was able to catch myself in that place and understand my body needed me to breathe it with conscious awareness for a period of time to bring it back, as you say, into that rest and digest. So what do you do in that lovely intimate moment when you're with someone and they've developed the self-awareness, and then they realize, oh my God, what I'm seeing is I'm in such a state of stress, I'm in such a state of panic, I'm in such a state of loneliness, and then I'm piling a whole lot of self-judgment on top of that. So they're not yet able to take the sort of healing or loving or beneficial action in that moment.
That's where I would normally start to introduce the idea of self-compassion. And sometimes in baby steps, because I know that you probably, and many people watching or listening have probably heard of Dr. Kristen Ness. I feel like she's the queen of self-compassion. And I can't remember how I ended up reading her book. It was probably 6 or 7 years ago. And I didn't get past the first chapter because I was like, no one gets anywhere in life when they're nice to themselves.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's a grief in that, isn't there? But also, like, that's so telling of, what was going on inside. So, like, I get it. And, again, maybe this is a Kiwi thing and, maybe a result of kind of culture that we have here. But, yeah, there often is resistance to compassion. There's exactly that same response. And I think me having had that very lived experience and that little anecdote to tell really helps them see that over time and taking it a little bit at a time that things can change.
Yes, and for me, as I'm listening to you, Hannah, there's an element of being able to tell a story about the experience that seems to be quite healing. I feel like we're kind of coming back to the writing zone. Because if it stays in our head and it's our own private experience versus it then becomes a story, because for it to become a story, we have to have made sense of it in some way. And then we're able to share it with other people. And just as you're doing now, the two of us can laugh because, my God, we can both relate to it. And so suddenly we realize, oh my God, there's connection to be had. There's shared understanding. We're all in it together. And I suppose it was one of the things I was thinking as I was reading your content. There's a beautiful piece on Medium that I think you literally write just before you're about to do an ultra run in Jordan. You haven't done the run yet. So this was well into the grief that you were experiencing from the death of a very dear friend, Caleb. And you said that something had popped up on your Facebook to say, win a competition.
Yeah.
And entering that competition really felt like a big step in your grief journey. But as I was reading the blog post, I was thinking to myself, there's such a story here. There's the story of you who was feeling very passive, your body was very exhausted from the grief, so there was the story of that experience, and then there was the story of this kind of call to action, the call to adventure.
Yeah.
And are you going to take that call to adventure? And that's such the narrative of the hero's journey. So what do you feel about this place that we get to, where we go from just self-awareness, kind of seeing our own personal experience, to then being able to make sense of it enough to find some kind of narrative and then share it as a story?
Oh, wow. I think probably that I'm almost embarrassed that you read that because that would have definitely just, from what I can remember, would have, or I can imagine how I was in that space. We've just been like, kind of, this is what's happening, and not really any thoughts to a narrative or craft around it. I was just like, holy moly, this is happening. And yeah, this is part of what I feel like I'm supposed to do to on my friend. So, uh, yeah, I think I might be going down the wrong tangent, but we're having to go with that question. But I think that when, like, it's helpful, but was helpful for me to like, there was the journaling piece, but that was also part, like, some of those milestones to put them out in public like that. But in the last couple of years, I have gone back to flesh those out, and with the benefit of some more space to add in, craft it into a narrative and a story, and bring in, really bring in, like, fleshing it out and turning it to something that someone might actually want to read.
I love the sense of that journey for you, Hannah, that those more raw first drafts, which are actually exquisite, I have to say. It's interesting to hear that you might come to those pieces with some judgment, but
Your dashing needs to come back.
yeah, I sense that, because as I was reading them, I felt very much with you. In fact, reading that piece that you, when you were about to do that ultra marathon, it moved me to tears.
It's beautiful.
And actually, I'm feeling it now just as I'm talking about it, because I very much felt, and this is actually something that I talked about in another interview with Jenna Butler, who it'll be coming up on the platform, where she talked about this concept that when we're sharing our stories, if they're stories of grief and trauma, not only do we have to caretake ourselves as we're in the process of writing them, but we also have to caretake the reader, because we need to write them in a way that either don't re-traumatize or traumatize the reader. So as I'm listening to your own writing journey, it's like you've written the pieces and you just kind of wrote them, but now there's a sense of, okay, what can I do with this writing, and can I come back to it and revisit it and start to put it together in a way that I can then imagine somebody else reading it. What, for me, as I'm looking at someone who's sharing some really valuable content on grief, which is such a tricky subject because you're wanting people to see it differently, how do you go about sharing content that you want to encourage? I don't know how grandiose your aims are. You want to encourage the world to have a different relationship with grief. Let's go big. But how do you manage sharing that content in a way that is caretaking the reader or the watcher?
When I'm thinking about, like, if we're talking about content versus the memoir that I'm writing, I approach the content very differently, and it is more of, when I do, I'm mostly doing Instagram lives at the moment, and that's all the content that I'm putting on Instagram. It's a really fun way to use the platform versus messing around back here with making grid posts and that kind of thing. And my intention around those conversations is mostly around that sharing these things so that people can see that they're not alone. It's basically the core of it. And when I go back and edit it and pull out the snippet and a blog post out of that, I really hone in on what do people kind of carry on pretending I'm in their brains, but what do I feel like? But I guess I have some great feedback from my audience and clients too, so I'm still learning, but with the lens of, like, what is most helpful for my audience, or what is, if someone's really feeling stuck, or that's more the lens. Perhaps there could be some more caretaking for people who are watching as well. Because it's heavy, can be really heavy stuff. And then when I thought, did you want to?
Well, I suppose that phrase, to let people know that they're not alone, because to me that feels so important. And this idea that just discovering that you're not alone in itself can be so profoundly healing. And like I shared earlier, when I came to this conversation, I had that voice in my head that was saying, you haven't lost somebody that you love. And yet I am also carrying a loss inside me. And I'm still working out the edges to that. And to me, that loss is about being on a very profound healing journey. And I think some of that loss is almost generational. It's like my soul's awareness of the entirety of the lives it's lived and how I'm in this huge evolutionary transition where I'm trying to change everything about the way that my body works. And then some of it is much more recent. It's the loss of perhaps the life that I thought I would live when I was a child and the life that I am actually living. But to come back on your phrase, this commitment to let people know that they're not alone, I just think that's such a beautiful thing to have at the center of what you're doing, because I think it's what we all need right now.
And what you just said reminds me, I feel like I heard someone speak about it, but the collective, or the grief that all of us hold from not living the life we dreamed we would live, is like the biggest unconscious grief that we hold as a collective. And I feel like almost everyone can resonate with that on some level.
Yeah, that's a great thing to just hold between us. For me, what comes up is the separation that I'm trying to make between the life that my ego wanted to live.
Yeah.
And holding the grief of that, because I'm not just going to say, oh, well, that grief doesn't count because it's my ego's grief and I hate my ego. It's like, actually, it comes back to that self-compassion piece. It's like, there's a part of my brain that has been molded by society and did think it needed to look and be and do in a certain way. And I need to hold that part in my brain and say, my friend, I get it. And then it comes back to the nervous system. Can I show it that it's okay to not be and look and be doing those things? And I think that applies to grief as well. There's almost like the egoic grief. Does that come up with the loss of someone, that kind of egoic grief that says, this isn't what it's meant to look like. This was kind of the egoic dream that I had for this relationship or for my life.
Yeah. A significant loss can shift that in a big way, and like your identity. And just before I go further there, what you're speaking to did bring to mind this that I do want to name, is that the folks who have experienced a death-specific loss, offensive's not the right word, but it can feel a bit like, oh, like you can't, if it's not a death-specific loss, you can't call it grief. And then there's folks like you who are, it's a loss of a different kind and feeling almost like an imposter. But I think it's in distance that it's not necessarily the event that we, the description of the event, it's the impact that it has within us. And that is so complex. And I was definitely in my early days, I was definitely in that camp of, I've experienced the death of some people that I really love and cherish, and how dare you come in here with the grief over, I don't know, I'm not going to give an example, but you see what I'm saying? And
yeah, totally.
And over time, like, that's taken my own, like, learning, and maybe with time and maturity, that has opened up that capacity for all of it, because there's all and we're all still figuring out how to do this.
When you say that opening up of capacity, what it's bringing to mind is something, I think it's on your website, where you talk about a gateway of evolution.
Yeah.
And it's making me think of something that you shared right at the very beginning, which is early on in your season of grief, you didn't feel that you could trust anybody. And then you shared, but now I know that's not true. And how, again, you kind of got this larger capacity. You've learnt self-compassion. So I'm really sort of getting this understanding of how losing somebody and the journey that you go through is a gateway of evolution. But I'd love you to speak a little bit more about that, and, you know, in the way that you really see it for yourself and how you're able to use that phrase and know what it means.
For myself, and that phrase that you're speaking to, as part of my vision for my work, like it originally started kind of from an internal place of, if I can help other people suffer less through that experience, then that's amazing. But I actually worked with a business coach last year, and she was like, make it bigger, like, why not? And so that's where it came to, empowering and supporting others, so that, or like everyone, so that we can be accessing like the aligned support that we actually need, and to be empowered in that, so that we can kind of be carried or guided or have people walk alongside us to allow us to evolve through adversity. And this is what typically we've seen in, and for good reason, in previous generations, is not having that base, and that kind of goes underground, or it gets suppressed, or it comes up in a really unhelpful way. And it seems like there's that limited, you kind of cut off from that potential of evolution, because this whole experience hasn't been integrated. Do you see what I'm getting at there?
I do, and it's coming back to that mind-body connection in understanding and healing grief. Because if it's all suppressed, it literally gets stored in the body. And then, to me, as I'm sensing into that, we're living that version of ourselves. We're literally living the version of ourselves that's carrying all of this, versus living the version of ourselves that has moved through it, that has integrated it. How does that process of integration happen in the specific arena of having lost somebody? When someone comes to you and they are carrying it in their body, how do you do that work?
At the moment, it is really like a grief and nervous system 101. So we, like, grief on its own, nervous system on its own, and how they come together. So basically, sharing towel, the slight freeze of the nervous system, and understanding how we're learning how an individual's response, what that looks like, and what those triggers or events are that set off those things, or where have we been camping out in for a long time. And then I think that the grief education, or that's a very sterile way to put it, but that's just especially what it is, like having a more helpful understanding of the grief process. It's not 5 stages. It's not done in a year. That doesn't have a set timeline. And those, because it's what we were speaking to before, like those thoughts, those expectations feed into that nervous system response too. So at the moment in my coaching, it really is like an education piece with some practices sprinkled through, but it's my approach that people, when they kind of have enough to go on to understand why, they can go out and seek the avenues of that like somatic or embodied support that serves them.
I love that you're focusing on the education, Hannah, because I have to say, when I began to learn about the nervous system, I began to understand the difference between being in a shutdown state and being in a relaxed state.
Yeah.
And that was such a huge game changer for me, because I noticed that I was coming to moments in my day, and most often in the evening, but not only in the evening, and I would feel exhausted. I would feel like I just wanted to just totally do something brain numbing, and I would think to myself, I've really tired myself out. And then I would come into a cycle of binge watching 2 or 3 shows in a row on Netflix, and then it would get to around about bedtime, and then I would go to bed. But then I would be waking up in the morning, perhaps having a couple of cups of coffee and getting going again. And this real understanding that what I was doing was literally being in a shutdown state and staying in that shutdown state until I went to bed, waking up in a shutdown state, which was why I felt so exhausted, and then jacking myself up with coffee to then put me into a stress state. And when I started to understand how to come out of that shutdown state is actually to consciously activate myself. So opposite to what I wanted to do, not binge watch Netflix, but, you know, for me, it's do some cold water swimming now, it's do some breath work, it's do some dance to kind of, and then once I'd activated, I could then relax. That was such a huge game changer for me. So it sort of makes me think now, and I'm thinking of the sort of state I imagined you in when you saw that Facebook ad for that ultra marathon competition. I can't quite remember your words, but you sort of described yourself as someone who checked out a little bit, which is totally understandable. You were sort of in this exhausted, depleted state. So how can we take that path to make a distinction? Is my body exhausted and doesn't need rest? Or am I in a shutdown state and actually I need to activate myself? What would you say there?
That's a really, I love that. And the education is so important. And I think even just us talking about it in that way, folks will begin to, like, that'll be pinging off some, that recognition of that then their own experience, because it can be like, you think you're resting, but you're actually just zoning out. And it's while we're like physically not still, it's actually, we're physically still, it's like underneath the surface, it's just kind of dampened down. That might be that heaviness that not like in depression, but not like a mental health diagnosis, but just that like heaviness, that fatigue, that exhaustion, that perhaps lack of motivation, just that real immobilized. Is probably the best way that I would put it.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. That's definitely how I can make a distinction between, have I shut down or am I in that beautiful state of rest and digest? Because when I'm in rest and digest, lying on the sofa feels like such a beautiful place to be, and I feel so engaged and connected with my surroundings, versus wanting to lie on the sofa and not be engaged.
I think it's that like rejuvenation comes to mind as well, is that sometimes, you know, maybe if it's something like a show that we actually really enjoy and we're really kind of engaged in that resting, soothing state, is that just blind accounts doesn't always in that numb mode.
Yeah.
Yeah, it can be rejuvenating, not always.
Hannah, I feel like we've done such an amazing journey. Like, thank you for being with me. Thank you for being with all of these questions. I love that we've touched a little bit on journaling, a little bit on the storytelling aspect, the content creation, kind of making that distinction between grief that comes from the loss of a loved one, the collective grief. I really love that we touched on that too, because I do think as a sensitive soul, I really feel that I'm hearing that.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to just give you a moment. It might be that there was an area that you thought we were just about to touch on, but then my questions went in the opposite direction and you're like, I really felt that there was something else I wanted to say there. Or perhaps just something that's come up in the journey that we've taken with our conversation today. So just a final moment for you to reflect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. It has been a really delicious, juicy journey. Is there anything else? Maybe a little bit more. I know you spoke about this before we hit record, is around that process of writing, from like that raw stage to crafting it to something like a narrative or a book.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that back up, actually. It's such an interesting one. I mean, I definitely want to hear your thoughts on this, because I know that you're in that place where you're crafting a memoir. But it's something I see where we can come to a point in our journey and we have that natural inclination to share. And I know that that's something very innate. That's part of nature. It's part of human nature to want to share and connect. And then the struggle we can get with trying to make enough sense of what we want to share so that it resonates with others, or trying to share an aspect of our journey when the journey isn't complete. As you said, there's never really an ending.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, how are you finding that process? Because you're writing a memoir, you're going to be talking about, I know that you've experienced the death of this dear friend Caleb, your father, your grandfather. How are you finding the process of shifting from just journaling on the page
yeah
to actually crafting?
I think, and people have asked me this before actually, so it's quite nice to be able to talk about it in public too. Is that I had support early on. I actually broke my ankle and I was like, I'm going to be sitting down a whole lot more than normal. So I signed up for a 9-week like intro to memoir course, and that was outstanding. And that led on to a 9-month mastermind with someone at Group SBL. And from there, that really set me up to complete a full first draft. And that was written just for me. It was taking those journal pieces, adding more to it, filling in all the gaps, and actually coming up with, start to finish. And then I had another beautiful writer who I really admire do a developmental review on that, and help me craft it into something that, can be publicly consumed. And it's been really interesting. Like, yes, it's been an emotional journey, and there have been I've learned so much more about myself, about those experiences, seeing things in a totally new way that if I hadn't tried to write them and explain it so that someone else could understand what was going on, in my internal world, that I just would have like left there and carried on with life. And they have been such a treasure having those insights and realizations.
Thank you for sharing that. I can so relate to the insights and realizations that can come from a real conscious writing process. And it's a real skill, so I'm super filled with admiration that you've got to this point, because it's just not easy to get to a place where you can actually have that first draft and you can see the story, and then you're willing to then go into a collaboration with someone who's shaping that story as no longer just your private journey, but then something that then has to be tweaked and shifted so that it can then be consumed by somebody else. Like, how able were you to surrender to that process versus, this is my version, this is what happened to me, it needs to stay like this, why are you trying to change it?
I think for me, I wasn't quite so attached, or perhaps it's just been with time and through the process, and having that full first draft. And I mean, even before that, the journaling was my raw story and experience, and that feels okay and complete, and that was just for me. And now I'm in the phase of, yes, like tweaking, removing, re-explaining, recontextualizing pieces so that I'm very much clear of the intention of what my work is right now. And that having that distinction has been so helpful, and it's definitely what I have suggested to other people, is like, do a whole draft for yourself, and don't worry about all the pacing or the balance between like scene and summary. Just put it all out there, and then you've got that, you've done that, and then you can come back with, whether it is the support. I definitely couldn't have done it without her. Have that new perspective and her decades of experience in wisdom. So, now in the place of, I guess, crafting it so that hopefully someone can enjoy it.
Beautiful. Yeah, thank you for giving us that little insight into the crafting of the memoir. Do you have a sense of when you want to share it with an audience? Does it feel too early to answer that question?
Oh, that's a great question. I feel like I should declare. What are we? June. By the 1st of September, I would love to have the second draft complete.
We heard it here. We heard it here. Let's see what happens.
Yeah.
Oh, Hannah, thank you so much for talking with me today. It's been so lovely to connect with you on this deeper level, having just spotted you on Instagram and felt drawn to want to have a deeper conversation with you.
Yeah, I love that, and feel like there are so many more rabbit holes to go down.
Yeah. Part two coming soon.
Thank you so much.